Good day, everyone, and thank you for watching our showcase. My name is Nick, and I'm the marketing specialist at MBS Scientific, and I'm also your operational host for today. MBS Scientific is a distributor of a broad range of scientific products and services. For today, we have invited our trusty business partners at GenTegra to give us an insight on ways you can stabilize your valuable samples. I'm joined by two colleagues from GenTegra. Firstly, James Nelson, who will host the presentation, and also joined by Patrick Smith, who will be able to assist you and help to answer any of your questions. We will answer any of your questions at the end of the presentation, so feel free to ask them in the chat. For now, without further ado, I would like to give the word to James to continue our showcase.
Thank you, Nick, and good afternoon to everyone in attendance. I'm pleased to present a very short and brief overview of what we call at GenTegra active chemical protection and how we believe it can be added to biobanking operations and provide an additional level of security and protection for samples being stored primarily for analysis of DNA. Jumping right into it, here's in the first slide, the red graph, if you will, on the left side of the screen is the results of a survey done by McMaster University in Canada, where they surveyed all of the researchers on campus that had freezer storage of samples, and they asked them, how often do you have power outages, and how often do those power outages cause sample loss? Now, by power outage, that includes not only the loss of electrical power, but mechanical failures that may have happened to their freezer that caused the freezer to go down as well. This study was done 5 going on 6 years ago, and as you can see, you're guaranteed 100% power failure problem of some kind within 10 years, and risks of sample go up to 100% within about 20 years. My personal feeling is that if you were to rerun this survey today at any major university, the slope on both of these curves would go up dramatically. Why? That's the picture on the right. That's a picture following Hurricane Sandy on the east coast of the United States about 5 or 6 years ago now, where it took out the power in downtown New York City. That is a photograph, aerial photograph, obviously, of the section of downtown New York City that had the power go out. There happened to be a rather significant biobank sitting on the 13th floor of an institution there, and they knew the power was going to be out for quite some time, and they literally had to carry samples down 13 floors and pack them off to a new biobanking facility in Indiana in order to prevent the massive loss of their biobank by that. My feeling and belief, based upon everything that's going on now, massive wildfires like we've never seen before, and storms that are called 100-year storms that are really now occurring every 10 years, it seems, that the risk to samples is going up dramatically, excuse me, as time goes by because of the environmental warming. So what does ACP bring to the biobank? Well, it doesn't bring everything. You can't replace the biobank's freezers, but if you've got samples that are samples being stored for later DNA analysis, active chemical protection can provide a level of protection that a freezer can't. Why? Because active chemical protection means storing at ambient temperature. And ambient temperature means freezers don't fail and the samples stay safe and secure even if the power is out because they're at ambient, so it doesn't matter. So it's long-term increase in the security of those samples, reduced operational costs for their samples because you're not generating the electricity and you're not paying the maintenance costs for freezers. Increased lab efficiency because, one, when you go to get a sample out of your biobank, it's not frozen in place, it's not covered with frost. If you go to an ambient storage space, the sample is easy to see, it's readily available, you pick it out, you can read the label, and you're ready to go. And also there's the advantage of reduced environmental impact, not only because you're using less electricity, but also because you're not getting another freezer that has the refrigerant in it that may be harmful, and all the other things that go along with just general use of additional electricity. What does active chemical protection for DNA biobanking mean? What can you do with it? Well, off to the right of the screen, you're seeing what we call our product GenTegra DNA, and it's available in virtually whatever format is necessary for the kinds and numbers of samples being used in the biobank. GenTegra DNA is for purified DNA samples. They don't need to be in a freezer. They can be put on GenTegra DNA as soon as they are purified and immediately go into ambient storage. They can be a archive backup, if you will. Example of that is Kaiser Permanente. They have a large biobank of human DNA samples. To them, it's a backup to their freezer samples. And they're very conservative. Their freezer has not only an electrical backup, but it has a liquid nitrogen backup, and it's got a backup of samples that are dry ambient storage samples also. You can also transfer samples from the freezer if they're already in the freezer. Example of that would be Alaska Fish and Game. They collect tens of thousands of DNA samples every year. They purify them and they put them on GenTegra DNA so that they don't have to put them into the freezer. And if they've been put on GenTegra DNA, they are ready to be shipped anywhere in the world without any concern for cooling, freezing, dry ice, or even wet ice. Active chemical protection can also be used for raw biological liquids that contain DNA. Most common there is blood, of course, which is very often stored or collected for later DNA analysis. And there the sample is collected and it's dried. The blood has to be dried on the card for 2 to 3 hours. And then it's commonly put in a simple paper envelope and it's now stored or archived as you wish. If they have samples of blood that are in the freezer that are no longer being actively sampled and aliquoted, then they can also be moved to that to a collection card and stored. And we also have a product called GenPlates, which is in the lower right-hand corner. And a GenPlate is an automation-friendly storage device that has GenSaver paper put into it in particular patterns that meet the application need. The one shown here is our most common and preferred GenPlate. It has 24 samples areas on it, and each sample area has 6 aliquots for 6 samples of most commonly blood or something like Buffy coat that has more concentrated DNA. Can also be used for saliva, if you will. Collection cards, as they're shown here, are in 2 formats. They're white for blood or any other biological that's visible. If it's saliva, then you have the dye card or the pink card, where when the saliva is put on the card, it turns white so that you know that the sample has been added to the card. Okay, what is active chemical protection? Here's a quick scanning electron microscope image of GenTegra DNA that's been put on a slide. What you see there, those grooves between the tiles, are really cracks in the GenTegra DNA that's been dried so that you can actually see it. It's a when dried, it's a clear plastic-like matrix that coats the DNA molecules. That coating protects and helps the DNA go right back into solution quickly. So very quickly, what's the overview of how the samples are used? If they're card samples, raw samples, particularly blood, it can be used in any one of these formats. It's collected, it's dried, it then moves to storage, which can be in a cabinet or a room that's air conditioned, if you will, controlling the humidity. Later, if it's time to extract it, you punch a piece out of the card, you extract it, you get purified DNA. That purified DNA can then be analyzed, NGS, and it can also be put onto GenTegra DNA, dried down for long-term storage or shipping, as the case may be. The cards are also can be punched, smaller punch, something like a millimeter or millimeter and a half, and go directly into PCR if that's the analysis. Very quickly, the GenTegra Card has GenTegra DNA on it, and here's a quick comparison. The most common card for collecting blood in the world is either a plain paper card or an FTA card. This is a comparison between GenTegra, which has GenTegra DNA on it, and both of those kinds of cards, the FTA card and a plain paper. That's what GenCollect is. And as you can see, the GenTegra is 18 times better at protecting DNA than FDA paper and 4 times better than plain paper. Down at the bottom, and I don't have time to go into it here, is the reference for a paper that we did and published 4 or 5 years ago, where we essentially stored DNA samples for what amounted to the equivalent of 20 years and analyzed them. The data shows that the samples are incredibly well protected when analyzed for HLA, which is a very rigorous method of checking it. Here's an example of some of the places, and I've already mentioned some of them, that are using our technology, either paper, GenTegra, or GenTegra DNA. National Institutes of Health has a 50,000 sample biobank that they've got, that they're waiting a certain amount of time before they go back and resample the people that are in that biobank, and then they reanalyze and do a genetic comparison. I've already mentioned Alaska. Stanford is using cards to go to Africa and track environmental health of endangered species. So very quickly in an overview, that's a very light overview of active chemical protection. We believe it has a place in the laboratory, in the biobank, and that it's not going to replace freezers, but it adds an additional level of security for those samples that can be put onto our active chemical protection technology.
And if you do have any questions that come to mind later on, you feel free to send them to info@mbsscientific.co.uk. All right, then I want to thank everyone for their attention, and again, feel free to contact us at info@mbsscientific.co.uk, or contact James through GenTegra, and we'll be happy to answer any of your questions.